All right, hopefully everyone sees Graphics Interface 2020. I'd like to call back out Pierre Poulin, who will present the next awardee.
Yes, so it is my renewed honor and privilege to introduce the winner of the 2019 Best Human-Computer Interaction Dissertation, Teddy Seyed. In fact, I tried to make the joke about how difficult it is to make the name sound too complicated, but I was not able, so I will stop the bad joke there. He completed his PhD at the University of Calgary under the supervisions of Frank Maurer and Tony Tang. I would like to thank the evaluation committee, who was presided by Celine Natsunek from Manitoba, and the committee was helped by Audrey Giroir from Carleton, Carl Duckling from Saskatchewan, and Robert Chiao from UBC. So it's an honor to have Teddy presenting his PhD work. So without further ado, Teddy.
Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. Yeah, I just wanted to start just by saying a couple thank yous. Thank you, Pierre, and the selection committee for the award. Obviously, I'm very honored to accept the award. It's pretty cool to see at the very end. And so I'll quickly run off my thank yous. First and foremost, I want to thank my parents and family, just for generally being there and supporting me through all the things I've done. Obviously, my younger brother, who's a bit younger, but sometimes was a bit wiser than me, even though I have a PhD. I want to thank my supervisors, Dr. Frank Maurer and Tony Tang, for supporting me through a lot of the crazy things that I did or didn't do through the PhD, which you'll kind of see in the presentation. Dr. Xingdong Yang for sort of guiding me through a lot of the projects sort of early on in the PhD and even now today. And last but not least, Dr. Chad Sanders for sort of letting me take the entrepreneurial path as part of the PhD. You kind of see that during the talk. I also want to thank my MSR colleagues at Microsoft Research, specifically Tom Ball, Pelly Tahalo, Mihai Moscow, Steve Hodges, James Devine, and Asta Roseway, and a bunch of other people who I met during my internship, which is sort of the tail end of the work that I did. And also my friends, both on the research side, as well as the friends I made playing hockey, since I'm a huge hockey fan. A lot of that kept me grounded during the PhD, which was quite a grind. And last but not least, I want to say, I am where I am today because of everyone that I mentioned at the start. And although it's my name on the award, it is still a collective accomplishment. So thank you. So as if probably, let's see if this works. Okay. So as you already know, I did my PhD at the University of Calgary. And so one of the things I wanted to mention was the fact that Calgary is home to the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. And obviously, since I did a lot of my work in that space, I wanted to give a sort of proper acknowledgement. So I just want to say I would like to acknowledge the Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nations, including the Siksika, the Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda First Nations. And I acknowledge that many of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. So I thought that was very important to say. Okay, so jumping to my actual talk. It's entitled The Entrepreneurial Thinking in the Design of Ubiquitous Computing. So what I did during my PhD was a little bit different. And as a result, I'm going to explain a lot of things I did through this work, sort of both the entrepreneurial lens as well as the research lens. So what you're going to see is sort of a linear line in a lot of the work that I did, but actually was a very much a sort of up and down crazy process. So quick definition of ubiquitous computing, I'm sure many of us are familiar with, but effectively it's about making computers and interactions invisible to the user. This is sort of Mark Weiser's vision. So I was working in the space of making technology invisible in many different areas. So I'll jump into next about what research and entrepreneurship sort of meant in the PhD. And so as I mentioned before, I worked kind of in both. So research side, it was very multidisciplinary. I mean, I worked in a number of different areas, whether it was oil and gas or fashion, which I mean is sort of crazy. I did a lot of software, hardware, design, and UX. And then on the entrepreneurial side, I took a lot of MBA classes as part of the PhD. I worked in startups, both as a PM or the lead UX designer, and I also co-founded a bunch of startups. So at a very high level, what this looks like, and sort of this is as I mentioned before, it's kind of the journey, but it looks nice and straight and it looks nice on a chart, but it's actually it was kind of insane. So on the top side, you kind of see the 3 areas that I worked in, which was ubiquitous computing and multi-surface environments, the idea of having multiple devices in the environment and how to interact with them. And then I sort of jumped into novel devices and interactions, and then looking at prototyping tools for novices. And there's a very much a, I mean, it looks nice again on the slide, but everything is sort of influenced by the other. So on the bottom, I had working for startups and building startups. And as I mentioned before, it was up and down, where when I was exploring ubiquitous computing, I was also working in startups. And then I also was doing stuff for doing things in novel devices. And I was basically learning back and forth. And then I also applied that to my own startups as well. And then sort of the last section, prototyping tools for novices, I then sort of brought the stuff I learned in my own startups back up into research. So in the purposes of the dissertation, I know I didn't cover all of the work I did. So these are sort of the projects I'll touch on really briefly in this talk. So as I mentioned before, I did ubiquitous computing. So that's the idea of like creating environments that have multiple displays or multiple sensors, which is very relevant to today's world. So I built a toolkit, which I'll get into a bit later. And then I did a couple of use cases, both in oil and gas and emergency response planning. I then looked into novel devices interactions, and I'll sort of explain why I got into that a bit later. So building, a sort of custom smartwatch and a custom smartphone. And then I jumped into prototyping tools for novices. So building work in the space of fashion and modular computing. So the next slide, I'm just going to show you at a very high level the sort of publications I did, just to sort of demonstrate that this is, again, sort of not a linear process. So as you can kind of see, I published a lot in a lot of different areas. Had a lot of amazing collaborators. You kind of see in the sort of the middle section, novel device interactions, I sort of stayed there quite heavily for a little bit. And that's kind of where I did a lot of the learning on the research side, which was also very applicable to me doing startups and product. On the flip side, I also did a number of different startups. Again, this is all sort of happening at the same time as the research is going on. So there's Teddy the researcher and Teddy the entrepreneur, and sometimes they didn't always work together very well. So I obviously started in oil and gas, obviously because Alberta and Calgary, and that was kind of where I did PMing and sort of working as a UX person. And then when I started building startups, this is when on the research side, I got really heavily into hardware. So my first one was a Kickstarter in the health industry. Then I jumped into algorithms for transit and optimization. And then jumping back into hardware, I did stuff for STEM education, VR and AR, motion analytics, and I also did not-for-profit, which is all directly because of the work I had done in research. So at a very high level, again, so a number of different startups. I went through different grant processes in Canada. I went through a number of different accelerators. I did a number of pitch competitions. I won a number of awards. So it was very much a back and forth process between the two. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about more on the research side, then I'll jump into the entrepreneurial side a bit later. And I've kept everything very high level just because I didn't think I would have enough time to sort of go through everything. So the first sort of way I envisioned this thesis was encapsulated by this diagram. So on the outer level, you have the application domain. So there's medical, there's oil and gas, emergency response, education. As you get closer into the middle is really about the user, right? This is effectively what HCI is about, how we use the things around us in the environment. Sort of going outwards from the user, we have the different devices, right? Like tabletops, tablets, Kinects, things like that. And then the networking that's necessary. So the idea for me was each layer of a ring represented different challenges. So the inner layer would effectively be things about interactions and techniques with users and devices. Whereas the next level might be, how do we connect all these different devices like phones and tablets and tabletops? So that's really about protocols and infrastructure. And then when you go further out into sort of the green space, it becomes about deployment and scalability. So these are sort of the areas that I sort of worked in, both on the research side and entrepreneurial. So talking about the exploring Ubicomp section, the first paper I'm going to talk about is so my early work, which is basically exploring multi-surface environments. So this is me building toolkits and sort of exploring different application domains. So the first one was the Society of Devices Toolkit. And in this work, we basically looked at this notion of being able to design a plug-and-play environment that was really easy to deploy and scale in any type of environment. So what I mean is if we wanted to do a project where there's an oil and gas customer who has multiple devices and we wanted to instrument a room, like how would you do it, right? And so that was sort of the driving scenario behind this. And so what we built was a sort of clever little JavaScript API that sort of encapsulated different sensor information, whether it was from the Kinect, a device, beacons, or leap motions, sort of abstract that into a JavaScript API built on web technology, so REST and Socket.io WebSockets, and then we provided native SDKs basically on top of that. This sort of preceded work now, which is much more popular, things like Xamarin, which are cross-platform APIs and systems. So this is sort of before that, but the idea here that it was driven was, again, being able to deploy these things at scale. And so we did 2 use case studies around this. So one was Skyhunter and one was ePlan. And some of the things we learned, I think, which were pretty obvious, was having multi-device collaboration is basically very, very beneficial for different sort of information roles and silos. So for example, in the emergency response scenario that we looked at in ePlan, there's different roles where people had different information, and it was very hard to get that information out of them in a traditional system. But the idea of having a multi-device system where it's easy to share that information, it sort of kind of broke that. One of the things I did learn in this project, both on the research side and entrepreneurial, is that a lot of this stuff at the time was still too cumbersome, right? Like you had to set up connects to basically track where people are in the room, which is sort of the fundamental building block of building a multi-service environment. The software was pretty tricky to build. And last but not least, there's what I learned here, most importantly, was we build a lot of cool stuff in HCI and in labs, but when it came down to like actually deploying it and giving it to people, the stuff they wanted was really, really simplistic. It was very much simplistic screen sharing, drag and drop notion. So it was a little bit more pared down than what I had hoped it to be at the time. And that might have been just because of our implementation. So next I jump into sort of the novel devices interaction techniques. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my focus more on phones and devices. So one of the things I learned both in my early work, both on research and entrepreneurship, was there's a lot of work to be done in like building these types of environments. So why don't we actually think about reshaping the devices we actually use instead of trying to instrument in the room? So that's sort of where I got into the space of looking at the actual devices that we use and sort of shaping them a bit differently. So that sort of jumps into the novel devices and interactions. And so the 2 works that I did there are Doppio, which is a smartwatch, which I'll explain in a second, and then a modular smartphone. And I'll also say a note that the Doppio work is sort of what led me on the tangent of actually doing entrepreneurship, and I'll get to that a bit later. So Doppio is effectively a dual screen smartwatch, and we use tangible interaction techniques to do different interactions. So the idea is like here, for example, I can peek underneath my watch and sort of have a private information of what's going on. I can use tangible techniques like the right side to do tangible interactions because it's on my wrist. And if it's the left side, obviously my hand is more stable, so I can do more tangible input. So this is sort of an example of using 2 screens to expand the input space of a smartwatch. So yeah, one of the things it overcomes is the smartwatch, the challenge of a small screen, right? The smartwatch is very small and it's very hard to type on a small screen. So the idea of having an expanded space, I think, was pretty cool. And one of the other contributions of this was a sort of tangible interaction language with different configurations and manipulations. So the idea being like you have left, right, up, down, you have all the different tangible interaction techniques, being able to top and on the bottom. So there was a whole interaction language that we came up with. For me personally, what was cool about this work, and we didn't explore it in this one, but on the next one, was the notion of having a wearable that you could basically share, right? So you have a second screen. What does it mean to actually share that device? And create basically what we call a shared or lendable device, which led into the smartphone that we built. And so the idea of this phone is a modular smartphone. And the idea is you have different pieces inside of it. And depending on how you attach or detach the phone, it does different things. And so one of the cool things about this was we did physical lending through modularity. So what I mean by this is, if you imagine this phone, there's 3 pieces that you don't see in it. So there's a bigger piece you see on the left side, and right above it slides out a smaller piece. And there's this implicit notion of trust. So for example, if I like you more, I'll give you, like if I have a piece of cake, and if I like you more, I'll give you a big piece, and if I like you less, I'll give you a smaller piece. So in the same manner, there's an implicit level of trust in the device itself. So if I trust someone more, I might give them a bigger piece. If I trust someone less, I'll give them a smaller piece. What also was really cool in this was the actually integrated the sort of lending mode into the operating system of Android itself. So there's a lot of notifications that are built in, things built into different apps that are all sort of sharing what is going on. So the notion is the lender always chooses how much information is being shared, and the trust is sort of implied based on how you physically detach the device. Last but not least, one of the last areas I looked at for prototyping for tools and novices was fashion. And I'll explain this in a second, but the work that I did in this space was basically making it easier for people who are fashion designers to create different types of wearable tech. The reason why I got into this space, pragmatically, and I've sort of stayed there now for quite some time, was Teddy, the entrepreneur, was building Doppio for real and traveling to China and getting the licenses for Android Wear, building the prototype, doing all the pitches. And one of the things I learned there was if I wanted to make a product that was compelling and different from what was going on in the smartwatch space, I needed to sort of expand my scope. And one area I looked at was fashion. Fashion, I think, is a very beautiful thing. Fashion has been around for a very long time, and I think it's the area that should inform where wearables come from rather than the other way around. So I wanted to look at the fashion space, and I sort of stayed there because it just was really fascinating. There's a lot of interesting work being done, and there's a lack of ability of people in that space to create beautiful wearable things. And so I sort of stayed in that space because of going to Doppio. So what I did with Maniket was effectively create a clever little plug and play tool for prototyping garments. So one of the challenges with creating wearable tech garments is that it's very hard to program a lot of things. You have to use a lot of different sensors. It's very hard to conceptualize even what you're going to build from beginning to end. So for example, a designer may have an idea with a garment that uses a light sensor in color or sound, and sort of that a lot of that stuff comes in at the end. And so the idea was you would have this sort of plug and play system where you could design a lot of the concepts at a very small stage, prototype it on a tiny mannequin, and the idea with the mixer, which you kind of see at the bottom left, is that you can sort of dynamically plug and play a sensor into this mixer, basically create whatever sensor interaction pattern that you want. And then whatever works on the small mannequin can then be taken and put into the full garment as well. So the idea of they can prototype from beginning to end on a small mannequin, which I think was really cool. So the idea behind this work is basically creating a collaborative tool for sensors, interaction, design. And one of the things I liked about this work was, although it was just one paper, it was effectively 3 years of work being really embedded in that space because of my entrepreneurial work around Doppio. Here I learned sort of the process of fashion tech and avant-garde, which is sort of the runway side of things. And I built the system and I basically deployed it for a full runway show over an 8-week period. So it was very, very intense. Last but not least, I sort of took some of that concept work and then applied it to some of the work that I had done at Microsoft Research at the time as an intern. Obviously I had learned a lot about plug and play devices and things like that during the previous work. So here we looked at, how do we make it easy to do plug and play for basically game-based learning? It's sort of a nice tangent off of the stuff that I had done there. So next I'm going to jump into the entrepreneurial side. So one of the areas I worked on a lot was the fashion side, and you'll kind of see that in a second. So here's how I sort of chunked out a lot of the stuff that I did. I mean, didn't cover everything for this talk or in the thesis just because there wasn't enough time, and I don't think Frank and Tony would have wanted me to have that much content. So yeah, basically I had the working for startups phase and the building startups phase. So the work that I did in the UBICOM section was sort of informed by that research space, and we sort of actually built systems and deployed them, which was a really interesting experience. And then building startups is sort of where I got into the heavy I would say heavy hardware and pivoting work. So one of the things I learned with Doppio was it was a good idea. I still think it's a great idea. It was very hard to pitch in Canada. Maybe it would have been different if I was in the States at the time. But I basically transitioned that out into something else that was effectively emotional analytics for AR/VR. And in this time, I also ran a number of Kickstarter campaigns. And I want to mention that the Maniket project that I demonstrated earlier was actually using product I had made myself during entrepreneurial work. So we had a little kit called Stitch Kit, which I'll talk about next. So Stitch Kit was a little sort of STEAM education kit that we did in Kickstarter, and it was super successful. We hit 300% of our goal in 90 days in basically 19 countries, and we had about 300 users basically right off the bat. So I think that was really cool. For me, one of the things that was the most favorite about this project was sort of the impact that I could make outside of both research and entrepreneurship. So one of the things I did during the PhD, and for me, this is probably one of the most important things I did, was sort of take the work that I had done, both as a researcher and an entrepreneur, and sort of basically just say, it's not really about publishing or making products, it's about actually like making impact. So one of the things I did was I went to Nova Scotia, and I worked with the Mi'kmaq community and a couple of my friends, Angel Abashan and Alex Matopias and Poisons. And what we did there was we basically taught fashion tech to Indigenous youth, specifically the young Mi'kmaq women. It was really cool because they took the tech that we had done and basically created new types of garments and new type of regalia, right? And the cool thing about regalia, and especially in the powwow, it's both young and old. It's both male and female. It's cross-generational, cross-gender, which is, I think, really cool. And we sort of experimented that for the first time, I think, in Canada, the notion of creating wearable tech garments. And it's a very interesting experience for me because typically as an entrepreneur and as a researcher, you're sort of leading the project. But this sort of forced me to take a step back and just be an observer and a facilitator, which I thought was a very important lesson to me personally as a researcher and as an entrepreneur. So in the entrepreneurial component of my dissertation, I wrote a lot of different, I would say, reflections, obviously because you can't put a full business plan into a thesis, I think. So what I instead did was put in a number of interesting reflections I thought would be useful for other people who wanted to continue on the path that I was on. So the first was making sustainable hardware, or making hardware sustainable is even harder. So one of the things that, you make a prototype in research, so now let's say you transition that into entrepreneurial product, the costs are almost effectively different, right? It's one thing to make a prototype where, you've got one or two. Now, if you jump into, 10, 100, 1,000, there's a number of different costs, right? There's the shipping, there's the packaging for each little thing. Where are you going to ship the thing to? Is it going to ship by air? Is it going to ship by boat? So there was a lot of other costs that I basically hadn't even thought of until I attempted that. So one of the things was consider those other costs. The other thing was timing. So timing was one of the things I learned. I mean, obviously, as researchers, we time our research according to our sort of conference schedules, and we sort of rush things out, maybe not to the best that they can be. So one of the things I learned here was time is everything, and we shouldn't rush things into a product and sort of consider the market. So what I mean by this is we launched Stitch Kit basically in December. Ideally, it should have been in September when school was basically opening. One of the things I learned was defining success within your team was different. So for me, success meant different things to the rest of the team. In research, I think success means, you get a great publication or award or things like that. And then an entrepreneur was like, yeah, having a great product or having impact, but does not necessarily mean it's the same thing for everybody. Having responsibility with the things that we do. I think for me personally, working as a PhD student, we have a certain way of working in documenting things and tracking, but that may not necessarily be the case with everyone else. So sort of keeping on top of that is very important. And last but not least, sort of always protect yourself. Not everyone has the best interest in mind, and if you want to know more on that, you can just email me. I could tell you some great stories. So to sort of wrap up, so contribution summary. So in exploring UBecome space, I basically built with some interns and collaborators an extensive multi-service platform. I think it's still being used today, actually. Examples of use cases driven from the multi-service platform, sort of real-world design considerations based on the stuff we had done. In the novel device interactions space, first sort of example of a tangible input language on a smartwatch, sort of the first example of what a lendable smartphone could be and could look like, and also guidelines for designing them. And last but not least, the sort of more recent work on Maniquette. So that's sort of the first definition of the fashion tech space. And as far as I know, it's one of the first examples of using a fashion show as the method of a study and deployment. So the first example of a tool that's modular for fashion tech. And in terms of the entrepreneurial side, I provided basic reflections as a grad student, working for a startup, and then sort of what it actually looks like commercializing the work from both research to product, and then sort of lessons that you can actually learn if you're trying to do it for real. And then on the startup side, I basically I sort of talked about two of the consumer hardware products that I did, both in creating them and launching them. I talked a little bit about how to pivot an idea and sort of demonstrating how to combine both research and entrepreneurship. So again, I just want to say thank you for listening, and I humbly accept the award, and I am now open for questions. And if you need any more questions, you can just email me at my email.
I think I'm the only one that can clap audibly. That was a great talk, Teddy. Thank you very much. Now we'll open it up for questions. So you can either type your question by clicking on Q&A below, or you can raise your hand in the participants tab, and then I'll call on you and unmute you to ask your question verbally. Maybe in the meantime, I'll start with one question. I thought it was really great how you're sort of giving this advice and sort of lessons learned along the way. I think this is super useful. And it made me think, we might have some undergraduates in the audience, and what sort of technical skills would you recommend these students to do to prepare for a PhD in a topic similar to yours? It really seems like you have a wide variety of different skills in terms of actually building things, but also programming and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think as an undergrad, I was pretty exposed to research up front, so I think that really helped me in sort of shaping. It's not so much the skill set, but it's I think the mindset that it gives you, right? Research makes you really think about, especially HCI, like the user, right? Like, how are they going to use your thing? What are they going to do? Once you start with that, then it becomes about, okay, now I actually want to build the thing that they're going to use, right? And so you sort of snowball from there. And then the entrepreneurial side, it basically just, at least for me, it took me completely out of my comfort zone. It was like one thing building Doppio for real, and then like next year, basically, I was in China, like walking the markets, trying to find like the right screen that it was great for like the video, but it wasn't great for like actually real, right? And then having random coffee shop chats with like people from companies who like manufacture displays. So it sort of just, I think the entrepreneurial thing sort of drags you along the way, and you just pick up what you need to pick up. But it is important to the research side because it sort of drives all that as well.
Excellent. So let's see here if we have questions. Don't be shy, everyone. Please type your questions or raise your hand in the participants chat. Yeah, so if we don't have a question from the audience at this time, maybe I'll be able to sneak in one more question. So you've done such wonderful work during your PhD. It leaves me wondering, where is this all going next? So where do you see the field moving? What are you excited about working on next?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So right now I'm actually doing a postdoc at Microsoft Research. So I'm actually sort of building on a lot of the stuff I'd actually done, which is kind of nice for PhD since you sort of continue the work you're doing. I think in terms of the space, one of the things that I learned, especially with Doppio in the latter part of the work with the fashion space, is that the wearable space should be driven by a different industry and not so much by the tech industry, which is kind of one of the things I'm focused on right now. I think there's a lot of work to be done. One of the things I didn't talk about as well is like, the modular kit that I did was nice on the STEAM education side, but it didn't solve a lot of challenges like, how do you actually integrate the sensors into like fabric for designers, right? And like, how do you actually make that type of thing easy for them to use? Like, right. So for example, if Nike or Puma wanted to come up with a shoe or a garment that had a lot of these things, you're going to need to teach their designers in order for them to actually make the things, right? So I think that's sort of where that space is heading. I think in terms of the multi-device things, there's a lot of work already being done. Like actually Microsoft's doing, they're doing their own sort of multi-device thing, which is kind of cool to see. The stuff that I've done before is actually being realized. At the time, it was a different company, but now the same company. So yeah.
Excellent. We do have a question here from the chat, and it might play off of the answer that you just gave. Hui Xin In asks, what is the future of the hardware space in HCI in industry and research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm actually working with a couple of people at MSR right now, specifically Steve Hodges. And so one of the things he talks about is sort of being able to scale the work that you do, right? It's very hard to make one hardware prototype. And then it's hard to make 100, but what do you want to make 100 or 1,000? There's sort of that process needs to be streamlined. And so I think one of the things that's going to happen in that space is we're going to basically eventually at some point, I think, sort of standardize what we're using in sort of our approach. My vision with Steve, and I guess actually Steve's vision is, if you use a standard set of components, you're building something that's done once, you can then take that same thing and basically apply it to manufacturing. So it's basically an end-to-end sort of thing. I think that's going to be more tightly integrated. I'm actually sort of facing this in my own work now where, we're all doing remote work now, and a lot of stuff I did during a PhD was sort of hardware based, and a lot of startups I did was hardware based. Even now I'm sort of learning how do we adapt our processes for this sort of COVID situation where it's hard to, you can't go to China now and manufacture hardware, but you can do it remotely. And so that sort of changes your technique in terms of how you build your prototype, because now what happens if I need to build like 5 or 6, I can't just build one anymore, because if one thing breaks down, then I have to order the whole thing again. So I'm actually doing a mini manufacturing already. So I think that's gonna have an impact for sure.
Excellent. All right, let's thank Teddy once again and congratulate him on this great award. Thanks and congratulations.
Thanks.